And I don't want to take any more time, so I'd like to get started. And it's my great pleasure to pass on actually the hosting for today's public seminar to CQ Fellow Dr. Rupalim Buhan. Take it away.
Thanks, Polly, and welcome everyone. Depending on where you're coming from, it's a bright, cold, really cold day in Toronto. And firstly, I'm very grateful for CQ for hosting this space and inviting folks who are seeking examples of deep thinking and collaboration and friendship as we try to generate important knowledge to advance different types of rights and concerns and better understand the inequities surrounding all sorts of practices that we may be part of or working with to address and generate new ideas. One of the things I'd like to start as well is to reflect on the spaces that we're joining. Many folks may be coming from different parts of the world. I'm here situated on the east banks of the Don River in Toronto, which has been the territories of many Indigenous folks for generations, including the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, Mississaugas of the Credit. It's a long-standing meeting place in Mohawk known as Toronto, where the trees meet the water, and for generations has been a place for reflection and for sharing and for trade. And under the treaty Dish with One Spoon, also inviting folks from the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe communities, and then those of us who are settlers to consider our responsibilities to share the benefits and the bounty of the Great Lakes region, but also to care for them. As researchers working at universities that are mired in the racial capitalist project of neoliberalism, that can sometimes be awkward. So I'm inviting you all to consider what that might look like in your spaces, your relationships to territories and peoples, and the various unlearning and learning projects and relearning projects that you may be part of. So for today, I'll just give a brief outline of our agenda. I'm delighted to have two of my favorite people in social work, academia, or just on earth, Stéphanie Wahab and Yoosun Park. I'll say a little bit more about our journeys together. And our goal today is to tap into the various ways folks are engaging in theory. When we were preparing for this conversation, we were thinking about our own journey. All three of us actually came out of the same university, University of Washington, at different time frames, studying in social work, doing different kinds of work in terms of the areas of interest, but certainly aiming to challenge within social work the kind of atheoretical positivist norm that I was just at an American social work conference and was surprised remains quite central to a lot of the knowledge production. And though this is a methodology forum, a key part of methodology are the ways in which we're theorizing our relationships, our understanding of the social world, as well as how we generate and produce knowledge. In our conversations with each other, one thing that came up was this notion, which frankly I'm not very familiar with, but that the phrase, I think Yoosun, you were the one who said, just as the finger pointing at the moon is not the moon itself. And there are many ways of interpreting this in Buddhist philosophy. And I took it as how we can become more aware of the theories that were motivating our interest and guiding us, and certainly shaping in a very iterative way our praxis, as we then seek to pay attention to our data collection, data analysis, data generation, and then the knowledge claims that we're making. So that was the spirit of this particular presentation. We will start with a brief presentation from each, both Yoosun and Stéphanie. I think Stéphanie's going to go first, then Yoosun, sharing to set the stage of their work, the theories and methodologies they've been working on, and the way in which theories have shaped everything from the research question to the analysis and dissemination process. And then in Yoosun's case, also doing deeply historical work, re-examining the kind of beloved concepts within social work as the part of, as the project of decentering some of the Eurocentric knowledge that is part of our profession and academic knowledge base. And then we'll invite questions from you all and discussion. We will, as Polly was saying, invite you to post comments and questions in the chat. We will likely wait towards the end to invite the dialogue with the chat, but certainly if there are any specific questions or clarifications, you can post them in the chat, and then we can ask the presenters to also respond and say accordingly. So I'm trying to think, I think I'm just going to launch it over and pass it over, Stéphanie, to you, and feel free to share more about where you're coming from. I didn't say so much. Those of you who may be interested, I work in the Faculty of Social Work at the University of Toronto. Very sorry for that. And my own interest is in the areas of methodology, critical thinking, activism, and social work. So I look forward to hearing from you all in the Q&A as well. So Stéphanie, I'm turning it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Rupalim. Bonjour, marhaba. Welcome, everybody. I'm speaking to you from the ancestral lands of the Multnomah, the Chinook, the Tualatin, Kalipuya, and the Watala bands of the Chinook along the Columbia River here in Oregon. And it's really a pleasure to be here with all of you and with Rupalim and Yoosun. Here's my plan. I plan to tell you a little bit about a qualitative research project that I engaged in with two colleagues. I guess I should say I am a professor in the School of Social Work at Portland State University, and I've been here since 2005. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about a project, a case study that took us 6 years. We've come to think of this project as a form of slow scholarship. And I both love talking about this project because it just felt really meaningful in a lot of ways. And I'm always a little daunted because there's so much to say. My intention is to really try and focus on theory and the ways in which this project was born of theory, and the ways in which theory served as a foundation that ran through every part of our research project. So I'm going to give you kind of a high level here, the big places where I think theory were relevant. And then I'm happy to go into deeper content once we get into the question and answers. And I'm going to do a combination of try and speak. I'll pull up a few slides, and I might at times read here, mute. At times, I might read a little bit from some of my work. So to begin here, I'll pull my slides up. Oh, I don't want that. So that I might here talk a little bit. I'm going to start by trying to set the stage a little bit for this project. And like I said, this was, we framed it as an instrumental case study design. And before I can even really talk about what we did and what the focus was, I'll say a little bit about how it came about. The two colleagues that I worked with were Dr. Gita Merotra and Dr. Erica Kimball, colleagues of mine in the School of Social Work. We all had professional social work experience in the domestic violence field. And also some of us had lived experiences of violence in our families. And when we came together, we were really clear that we wanted to engage in a project that was focused on intimate partner violence, domestic violence, given our shared interests. And at the beginning of our conversations, when we were trying to imagine, well, what do we want to do? What do we want to focus on? We were all very interested in feminisms and the roles of feminist theory in the kind of training and socializing of domestic violence advocates. And as we spent months and months talking about our ideas, our commitments, it was really clear that we can't just focus on gender and feminisms. We also wanted to focus on race and class and the professionalization of domestic violence work. Then we realized we couldn't not think about mass incarceration, the increased criminalization of domestic violence itself, and then of course neoliberalism. And so over the course of 3 or 4 months, we engaged in a lot of conversations to identify, what do we care about? How do we bring some of these ideas together? And our process was slow. And like the title of my talk, we've eventually come to understand our research as a form of slow scholarship. What I'll say about that is we did not set out to engage in slow scholarship, and drew inspiration and now feel like it's a useful framework for us to think about the 6 years of our work together and just the various and interwoven phases of our research project. To say that our project was not linear, one, I think highlights some important key aspects of slow scholarship. And what I want to do is maybe spend just a minute or two saying a few things about slow scholarship, and then I'll come back to the actual kind of what we did and some of our theoretical ideas. So even though, like I said, we didn't set out to do slow scholarship, I think once we realized that, it took us a year to pull our theoretical framework together and essentially create this conceptual map that would then guide everything that we did in our research project. Once we realized how long that was taking and why that was taking so long, it was relational. We were engaged with community partners and coalitions and domestic violence advocates in the community who were actually doing the work. And we were going back and forth with folks saying, hey, what do you think about these ideas? That's at the point where we started looking around to learn more about, slow scholarship and how others have theorized and talked about what that is. So many scholars have moved beyond slow in slow scholarship as being uniquely referencing pace and duration by calling for different conceptualizations of time. For instance, Leibovitz and Boselek suggest that slow be rooted in deliberateness, thoughtfulness, interdisciplinarity, generating room for creating and nurturing pleasure. They also emphasize the centrality of relationship, working against binaries, and then questioning the nature of knowledge itself as a central tenet of slow scholarship. So the ways in which, and this is again, like in hindsight, when we now going to talk about our project as a form of slow scholarship, these are, I think, 4 important markers that we've discussed. And I think there's a link, or there's at the bottom there, a link to the publication where we talk about our project as slow scholarship, but really reimagining time, right? So it's not just pace and chronology, a relational ontology, moving towards complexity, and then embodiment. And I don't plan to focus on those now, but I do want to weave this into how I talk about our project, because our work came out of our relationships to each other, our relationship to domestic violence and intimate partner violence that spans decades, as well as our relationships to doing the work and community partners who were doing the work. And it came out of our struggles around our complicity in criminalization of domestic violence work, our complicity in the ways in which social work can often be an extension of the state, even as we are working towards social justice and interrupting forms of violence. So kind of in those lines, let me say now a few words about kind of some of the philosophical assumptions and start bringing in more of the theory, and then I'll get to the methodology and the methods, if that's all right. So first, we rooted our project in a post-structural feminist epistemology. And we began with the assumptions that identities are discursive and contingent, and that identities, including but not limited to gender, are socially constructed. We claimed our work as feminists because of the ways that critical, intersectional, post-colonial, queer, feminist of color theories shaped our understandings of domestic violence work, as well as the big macro forces that make certain kinds of domestic violence work possible and impossible. We also claimed the work as feminist because of the slow scholarship and the ways in which engaging in this theoretical, relational, theory-driven work for us really felt like this resistance to the neoliberal academy. And finally, a feminist ethic of care, a commitment to praxis, social justice, and attention to power, privilege, and oppression influenced every step of our project, including our initial imagining of the research question itself. Okay, so a few more things about then the conceptual framework. I mentioned that the project itself, let me see if I can talk about some of this without really my slides for the moment. So I mentioned that the project was born of theory, and then that theory served as, I think scaffolding is a better way to think about it, as a scaffolding for all the pieces of the actual doing of the research. In these conversations that took months and months and months, and then over a year to kind of pull together, what do we care about? We identified three big macro forces that have a significant influence on the doing of domestic violence work. And when I say doing of domestic violence work, where I'm really thinking about advocates, service providers who work individually with people who are experiencing violence. And those three forces included neoliberalism, the professionalization of domestic violence work, and then the criminalization of domestic violence work. And we realized that we weren't able to focus on one of those forces without considering the others. So we came up with this concept of the braid that for us really represented the ways in which those three strands were dependent on each other and function together to make certain kinds of domestic violence work possible and impossible. So from here on out, I'll be referring to the braid and the ways in which that theoretical framework, if you will, was the scaffolding for our project. So once we had these ideas and came up with the braid, we then set about, well, how do we study this? And we were, I mentioned, in conversation with a lot of community partners, different domestic violence agencies. There's an Oregon State Coalition on Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault. And we had lots of meetings, lots of conversations. Here's what we're thinking about. Here's the braid. What do you think about it? And we always received the same feedback. And that was, this is amazing. This makes sense. We love it. And there was this sense of hesitancy and really concern that came from the community that the findings of such a study might be weaponized and used against people who are actually doing the work. So folks in the community were saying, these ideas, they resonate with us, they absolutely make sense. And we know that the city commissioners are always looking for, cutting money from domestic violence work. And given that we were coming to this project with this critical kind of power analysis, the concern, and I think rightly so, from folks doing the work was that a project like this may be used, against those providing the services, which was really kind of a quandary for us. We had identified two values before we started putting this project together, and they were do no harm, it's kind of feminist ethic of care, and produce something that was going to be useful to the practice field, that was not just going to be heady and academic, but had some relevance for people who were actually doing domestic violence work. So that took more time for us through our relationships, through our dialogue, through thinking, how do we then, do a project that won't be harmful to the people that we care about and to the people that, we hope to produce something useful. Hence, we settled on studying the training and socialization of domestic violence advocates. We felt like this way, no particular agency, no particular coalition, or even advocates, the people doing the work, would be the focus of our gaze, but rather this would be a way of studying how the Braid is perhaps infused and or resisted through the training process. Just to give you a tiny bit of background, I realize I'm going to have to really rush here. Most domestic violence agencies send their advocates to these 40-hour domestic violence trainings. I think that's pretty widespread. Maybe I see Rupalim nodding. Definitely in the United States, maybe Canada as well. And so that's what we studied, were these trainings. The Oregon State Coalition put together a 40-hour online training, and we said that's what we're going to study. So let me move on and get to the specifics of the research.
But Stephanie, probably around 4 or 5 minutes to wrap up.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to move along. So I mentioned it was a qualitative study. It was an instrumental case design. Instrumental case design is an opportunity to look at a particular case. In our case, that was the training of domestic violence advocates, by looking at it through these different elements. And our research question, in case you're wondering, was how do the forces of neoliberalism, criminalization, professionalization, braided together, shape domestic violence advocacy work in the state of Oregon? Because we were doing this kind of design, we relied on multiple sources of data. And that included content analyses of federal and state policies focused on not just the training of domestic violence advocates, but this very particular legislation that conveys confidentiality privileges to advocates, such that they are not mandated reporters around child abuse and, domestic violence. We engage in a content analysis of the 40-hour training. We engaged in participant observation as people who went through the training as well. And then we conducted a number of interviews. We had semi-structured interviews with all kinds of people in the community, those who created the training, those who took the training, folks who chose not to take the trainings as well. And we were looking for where and how does the braid surface in the training, right? The training process itself, and where and how is the training perhaps trying to resist and subvert these oppressive forces. Our analysis, we use many different kinds of analysis, given that we had different kinds of data, inductive, deductive coding, thematic analysis, lots of collective meaning making. And then because of our commitments to the practice community and the people actually doing the work, we engaged in dissemination processes that were at the community level. So with different community groups, state coalitions, meetings, conferences, but then also different kinds of academic settings. I will pause. I think those are the bullets, and happy to return to any pieces of this project later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. And for everyone, this is certainly not the end. We realize the amount of time is incongruent with the level of depth that each of these projects are involved in. And hopefully it can serve as questions that you all have. And we'll turn to Yoosun and then also invite a dialogue following where folks can, I'll start and then others can join in to raise questions. And I think one thing I'll appreciate from having known both of these folks is like Stephanie really building off of the direct personal engagement in the field, doing anti-gender-based violence work, working alongside folks as a scholar, as an activist and social worker, and the nuanced and rich theoretical framework that then guides the research, and then the selection of a very precise site of analysis in these DV trainings. And then we'll turn to Yoosun, who a very different site, but I think you'll see the same kind of very thoughtful, theoretical driven work to uncover some of the ideological, I guess, investments that social work continues to have. So I'm going to pin Yoosun. And for those who are trying to navigate, you can select in the view the speaker. That'll allow you to see Yoosun or a gallery if you'd like to see everyone. All right, take it away. You are still muted, Yoosun. There you go.
Hi. Thanks for having us. And all I see is Rupalim for some reason.
If you go to gallery under view, you can see everyone if you want. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm going to walk through this really quickly. And it occurs to me that as Stephanie's talking about slow scholarship, our meeting spaces like this also are incongruent, right? As Rupalim just said, to structurally incongruent to the kinds of work that we're trying to do. So I am from University of Pennsylvania, and the work that I do, I'm going to talk about sort of my philosophical underpinnings first, and then talk really briefly about a particular project that I've done. So let me do my attempt to share my screen. That's always the nerve-wracking part. Here we go. Can you see that? Oops. No, that is not what I want you to see. Okay. Yes?
Looks good, yeah.
Okay. So I thought I would begin by talking about critique, because I think of all my work as based in critique, and all my work as critical. And I think the word critical is being used increasingly in the academy, but in ways that I'm not really always so sure that I agree with. So I wanted to give you my definition of what I think about critique. And that is the practice of exposing interests that undergird an argument or a position or a theory or an intervention. So I think what's underneath is what we're trying to get to. And I think mostly in our research, we focus on the top part, this part, and do not really consider what's underneath, what underlies, what undergirds what we think about. So I think of critique in my work, a la Foucault, as an investigation of what types of assumptions of familiar notions, of established and unexamined ways of thinking. Accepted practices are based, whether that's research or education or anything else. And I should apologize for the wordiness of my slides, but my data is usually text, so and it sort of can't be helped. And I think theoretically, where I really reside is in the post world, and postmodernity is really not where I would go. Post-structuralist is how I generally tend to define myself. But I really like this Yoosun quote about the approach, that it's a style of thought which is suspicious. And it's suspicious of classical notions of truth, reason, identity, and objectivity, of the idea of universal progress or emancipation, of single frameworks, of a single idea, and grand narratives. Any explanation that says this is it, this is universal, and this is eternal, as ultimate grounds of explanation about the world, about how we know things, how the world exists. So this is where my scholarship is based. And another way to put it is radical skepticism. Radical meaning from the roots, again, underneath that the water rather than above it, and the idea that truth is constructed rather than discovered. That it's not out there for us to find, that if we just have the right methodology that we're going to get it somehow, but that it's actually socially constructed, and that all truths are relative to the frame of reference that contain them. And this means that I'm not really interested in saying, no, you're wrong, I'm right, so you should follow my ideas instead, or that somehow I'm trying to replace one with another. And that these frames of truth or discourses constitute the very truths that they claim to discover. So it's a game that is contained within the parameters of the game. So I think post-structuralists tend to talk about truth versus small truth versus the big truth or a universal truth, multiple truth versus a large truth. So I'm going to talk to you about the two different types of research that I tend to do, but they are sort of exist under the rubric called discourse studies. And discourse meaning not just language, but discourse meaning all kinds of social practices. So we're not just talking about textual analysis in the sense that we're talking about text or talk. And to me, it is a mode of critical social analysis grounded in the assumption, and this is, I'm repeating myself here, that meaning is negotiated rather than found, just as truth, and that knowledge is produced rather than discovered. And again, practices systematically form the objects of which they speak. So discourses, this is the important part, are not only social products, but that they have fundamental social effects. So they are productive and not descriptive, and that they are fundamentally modes of power. So in a sense, I guess what I could say is that all my research is really about studying power, an analysis of the power. So one set of studies that I focus on is history. All kinds of histories, but a lot of it histories of immigration and immigrant populations. And they are histories of the present. It's a Foucauldian terminology talking about the fact that I begin with some puzzlement, some idea of the present. So why is this happening? Or why are things such? Or why do we think this thing? And then go back to the past to try to illuminate that present day problem. And here's some of the works that that have done that. One of my latest ones is this one on top called that is looking at the Americanization movement and social workers in the Americanization movement, and Americanization movement as a massive national movement that actually had to do with what does it mean to be a nation? Who are we? So who is an American? And what does the nation as the American nation mean? And of course, as you can see by the title, it was a massive white supremacist project. Facilitating Injustice is a book I produced in 2019, and it's about social workers' involvement in the forced removal and incarceration of Japanese Americans. I won't talk about all of them. And move on to some of these works are more theoretical, and some of these works are less theoretical and more historiography. And where it becomes more historiography is when there were no previous works, like in this work on facilitating injustice, where I really actually had to try to piece together what happened in particular ways, or at least who was involved. So they tend to be less analysis and more history. I should say. And then what I wanted to talk to you sort of in depth about was this keywords project. Keywords, Raymond Williams's keywords project. So words that become nodal in a particular discipline. And the fundamental question that in these studies is, what does X do? So I began in my doctoral program, actually, on the word culture, because culture is a word that's everywhere in social work, as in so many other places. And it pulls together so many different ideas, and it becomes sort of the X of so many different ideas. But I wasn't interested in looking at, and if you follow post-structuralist theoretical positions, you'll know that I'm not trying to figure out what is culture. Which I think is how we generally approach most research in the health and social sciences. But I was really interested in, what does culture do? What does the concept of culture do in our discourses, meaning social work discourses? And so I've begun a whole series on this. And the one I wanted to talk to you a little bit more in depth is the second one, Disciplining the Risky Subject, a discourse analysis of the concept of resilience in social work literature. This was done with two colleagues. Actually, now that I think about it, are both Canadian. Donna Jeffrey, who is at UVic, and Rory Krath, who is at Smith College, but was trained at U of T. So, you know, we begin to notice that the word resilience was absolutely everywhere, and got very curious about, what does this do? So I'll talk a little bit more about that. I'm currently almost done with this paper. I'm working that my doctoral student, one of my doctoral students, heading on the concept of trauma, which, as you will also notice, is everywhere. And it's called Trauma as the Belief that the World is a Dangerous Place, the Obfuscation of Systemic Violence in Social Work's Trauma Discourses. And that title has to do with our sense that if trauma is indeed predicated on the wrong belief, the problematic belief, somehow less than normative functioning, that belief that the world is a dangerous place, then how do you then make sense of things like systemic racism or sexism, which actually would tell you that the world is indeed a dangerous place. So if trauma can answer, is the word to actually talk about that, then we have a problem in this discourse. And then another one that we're currently working on with my colleagues Donna and Rory is on the concept of empathy, seeing from the inside. And that term really came up because in this analysis, what we're finding is, as in many of these terms, empathy is really used as a really productive tool to produce cooperation. And empathy was a really kind of an interesting one, because it also pulls at this notion of authenticity and genuineness. That you can have if you can actually have an empathetic relationship with somebody, an empathetic relationship to somebody, reaction to somebody's troubles, pain, then not only it gives you a lot of cred and a lot of inside cred. So I won't get into that so much, but the next one on deck is self-care, which, you know, I think many of us are noticing as a supremely neoliberal terminology. And And if any of you actually have a term that you would like to work on, please contact me. I'm trying to build a whole book out of these. This is a long term, but oops, I have to show you. I came across this article in the New Yorker right after the World Cup, and it's about Lionel Messi. And it struck me as such a good description of discourse studies and discourse analysis. So I'm just going to read it to you. Messi is the, sorry, where is it? Messi is soccer's great ambler. To keep your eyes fixed on him throughout a match is both spellbinding and deadly dull. It's also a lesson in the art and science of watching a soccer match. If you ask any astute observer, they will advise you to take your eyes off the ball when you're doing this kind of research. The idea is this: to apprehend the main thrust of the narrative, to really wrap your mind around what's going on in a text, in a discourse, you must shift your focus from the foreground to the background. So in a sense, you have to take your eyes off the top of that iceberg and go to the bottom, and you have to look at where the context of that iceberg is. When you learn to bifurcate your brain, keeping an eye on the main action while devoting equal or greater attention to what's happening off the ball, the gain opens up to you. It is then you begin to pick out trends and patterns, the positions that individuals are taking up in and out of possession. And you can think about this as different types of arguments, different types of positions, the shapes and formation that teams are assuming when they attack and defend, the spaces that are opening up on the pitch, and the ways that the adversaries are or aren't exploiting them. So, and this is also, it's actually really an incredibly Derridian, Jacques Derrida's way of understanding text, sort of foregrounding and backgrounding, and what's at the margins and what's at the forefront. So I'd be happy to talk to you more about this, but I just thought it was a really beautiful way of explaining discourse studies. So just to really I just have a couple of slides on this. So the study on resilience, as we were starting to do this, we discovered this poster by Tracy L. Washington, and it's Louisiana Justice Institute. And it said, "Stop calling me resilient." Because every time you say, "Oh, they're resilient," that means you can do something else to me. And I'm worried about what's coming at me, right? So we began with the idea that resilience discourse is everywhere. And that more than that, it was entrenched as an unimpeachable terminology, unimpeachably productive device for empowerment. Because I think where in our research, we've discovered that where resilience discourse comes from was as a reaction to and a contestation of risk discourses. So this comes out of a strengths-based, and it comes out of really good ideas. But where it has ended, we think, is something different. So, and to take Wolf's explanation of post-humanism to talk about what our goal was, our point was not to reject resilience, because we believe, yeah, there are lots of values and aspirations to admire in resilience discourses, but our aim was to show how those very aspirations for strength-based and empowerment were undercut by the philosophical and ethical frameworks used to actually conceptualize resilience. We don't think it does what it meant to do. We're not quite sure that it actually can, but that's a whole nother problem. So our methodology was, again, really to try to get to what does the concept of resilience do? And our questions were, how do resilience logics confer certain problematics and not others as recognizable sites for investigation and interventions? And what are the implications for using resilience discourses for communities and its sightlines? Because resilience, as I'll tell you in 1 second, is really talked about only in certain populations. So methodology, like one-line methodology, is that we took social work databases and found every article that we could find that had the word resilience, resiliency, or something close to that in its title. There were about 100 and something of them. And then we took 36 randomly selected articles and did close reading. Close reading to apply pressure to a system of concepts and to upset it as to make its presuppositions and its limits more apparent, is how I'm going to describe it. What we found in our analysis, and there's a lot more to our analysis, but I'm just going to show you a couple points, that resilience is a normalizing judgment, that it was actually tautological, meaning all of the studies seem to take, we know what resilience is, we know what strengths is, and we're going to now find it in the people and call that resilience. So this is a quote, in the 1970s, research on family strengths burgeoned. These studies endeavor to distinguish well-functioning families from poor-functioning families in order to profile the characteristics of strong families. Those characteristics of strong families were resilience. Right? That's what they called resilience. And it was things like, this is from a different study, but having relationships with a group of socially acceptable friends and displaying socially acceptable behaviors was what was called resilient behavior. So I hope you can see that these actually take already dominant, already existing ideas about what is good, what is bad, what is healthy, what is not healthy, and take those ideas and then call them resilience. And then you look for them in people. And those people who actually exhibit them are resilient people. So, and then resilience, over and over and over in the articles that we investigated, were internal reserves. And they were always seen as resilience was an individual responsibility. It resided in bodies. And what that did in our analysis was it elided structural risk. So it erased things like race. So you could have an entire article that had 90% population that was racialized populations, but race would not be a site for investigation. It was just a demographic information piece. And culture became something that was quite similar. Rupali, do I have 5
maybe
minutes?
Another minute or two to wrap up? Yeah,
great.
Thanks.
And that what this made, in our view, what this was doing for the populations was docile bodies, people who were could be disciplined and were disciplined through these studies, through these interventions of and this notion of resilience. People who would comply. This is the slide I'll show you, but what was really clear to us, and this is a quote from Wahab, my favorite quote from Wahab, in fact, to be anglicized is emphatically not to be English. And he's talking about colonial India, I think, at this point, to that all attempts to become English was in itself a sign that you were emphatically not English, right? And we found the same phenomenon in this resilience discourse. Oops, sorry. That to be resilient is emphatically not to be normative. Hope that makes sense, and I'm happy to answer questions about that. And that normative subjects do not need to strive for resilience. Because they define, I'm sorry, that should be resilient, because they're not risky populations, so they do not actually have to have resilience to survive resilient. So the risk laden need resilience or to become resilient. But that risk that renders them as people who need resilience always renders them a faulty subject who are constantly under perpetual risk, because you cannot become English if you need resilience. So finally, what I'll say is that all of the articles that we looked at, almost all of the articles, would mention something about the fact that people live and need resilience because of structural problems like racism or poverty, so on and so forth. But that recognition was always then elided in favor of individual attention. So even all the articles that would say that the end, interventions or the research that they've focused on were things like, okay, so we'll give them training, work training, mentorship, so on and so forth. So to us, the discourse of resilience, what it did was a sleight of hand that mentioned the risks, but then pulled it out of your sight as something that we check the box and we're talking about it, but actually what we really need to fix are the people. So I could say a lot more about it, but I'll stop there. Yeah, and then we can take questions. I will stop share.
You, yeah. Amazing. I know my brain is like firing in lots of directions, even though I know you both so well. And I didn't do a very thorough introduction. For those of you who may not know us, we had the privilege of journeying together as editors-in-chief of Affiliate, a feminist journal of feminist inquiry, newly titled. And in that space, in part, I want to remark on that work we did collectively, because the academic enterprise is very mired in what both of you are paying attention to in terms of the power dynamics, whether they are through the lens of neoliberalism and professionalization, and even the criminalizing discourses that show up that elide, as Yoosun was saying, the structural inequalities and violences that we're part of, that the academia is part of and maintaining. And I'm just curious, when you think back on the time of shepherding people's publications through, where do you see the potential for this slow scholarship today? I see the dedication in the work both of you are doing, and even the level of expertise. And I say that in the sense of having dwelled in an area deeply and intentionally, having a level of admiring even the power dynamics you're paying attention to and understanding it deeply. Where is the potential for this to displace existing power dynamics where we work? Maybe that's too big a question, but I'm just curious, where would you take that question? Any direction you want. Yeah.
Well, I'll say a couple of words. I mean, that's a conversation the three of us have had often, even to the extent of is it ethical? Is it right for us as mentors to junior faculty, to doctoral students, to train them in these ways, given the scarcity of academic positions that embrace and support critical scholarship, qualitative scholarship, feminist, queer scholarship. And I guess my response is the potential is the disruption of a grand narrative, at least in social work, that to, get a job, to get tenure, to be seen as legitimate, one must do quantitative, positivist, post-positivist, and in social work, intervention kind of based research. And part of our slow process, as I mentioned, was time, it was relational. And the ways that we've thought about our project as an act of resistance and creativity has to do with the fact that we really had to get creative. We did not have funding. We were all on, different timelines of our professional journey. Untenured junior faculty, full professor. We got creative about how to repurpose the resources that we did have, whether that was time, whether it was relationships and status, whether it was funding from other projects. So I guess my response is that it's not for everybody and it's an option. But I also think it's an option that requires a collective approach and a team. It would be a really difficult road, although I have colleagues, I think, who do go that road to go the slow scholarship route alone, even just kind of, in terms of morale, it can be lonely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I don't know, Yoosun, where you want to take that question, starting off as a historian, which is already an unusual path in social work. And I have memories of seeing you wandering the halls with your dissertation when you were poring over social work journals over like a 50-year period, and then also looking at fiction written at the same time to kind of give you a sense of what was happening, like the backing up piece that you described. But I'm wondering where this fits, do you think, in the academy today? Yeah.
I mean, I think where I am heartened is that the students that are coming in, the junior faculty, the doctoral students are the people who are pushing for more thoughtful, critical work. And the people who have the most trouble are the established people, which I guess, I have to put myself there. But, to me, and, it's just not me saying this, but Derrida said this, that this work is a political imperative. That this isn't just sort of head scratching, that this is actually work to actually look at your epistemological foundations is something that is absolutely critical, especially I think in Canada, where you do talk a lot about things like decolonization. If you're not doing critical work, then you certainly should not be even using those words, I think. But the resistance is so huge because the problems are not just that I don't want to do this or I don't know enough about this, but that there are so many structural barriers to doing this. And so I'll just talk about one, and this is something I don't think that people think about a lot, but think about how many pages you can put into a journal article. I remember doing an article for the British Journal of Social Work, which is a really highly regarded journal. They have a 7,000 word limit. And your references are actually part of that 7,000 word. But when you're doing work like me, where where your data has to get referenced every time you use that piece of data, 7,000 words go really fast. And so I think it was one of the big moments when I realized, wow, it's not just that people are telling me this is not, or that it's marginalized in particular. It's marginalized in ways that we're not even seeing. And there are structural constraints against doing this. So there was one journal in social work that has no page limit. And so it really is the one journal that can publish historical papers, for instance. So, and if you think about the funding behind all this, there's so much of this. So I think we need to fight back. If you actually want to do critical work, you have to look for what are the constraints that are happening. That's not just about, I don't have a professor that I can go to, but what are the actual built environments that are constraining us, I think.
Thank you.
And we've talked about this for, months,
yes,
so
no,
days,
I can go on.
on.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things I was reflecting on, and I would like to open it to the floor after I share this reflection, but and I'm going to say this very frankly, so apologies to those of you who are engaged, but I'm at this point of just, when you have too much of something, you start to feel nauseous. I'm at this point of almost nauseum, and I'm involved in this too, of all the scoping reviews that students I know are involved in and colleagues I know are involved in, and this presumption that this is the best way to produce knowledge, which often perpetuates the obscuring of all the different inequalities, because a lot of the scholarship was not critical to begin with, that they are scoping in the review. And the antidote that you all offer, I'm calling it an antidote, right? This very, very different, very theory-driven research work, very textually driven, is almost like an antidote to this apparatus behind us that's pushing for all these scoping reviews. This is my opinion, not everyone's, but it's one of those thoughts I had as you all were both speaking. But I would love to open the floor. If people want to write in the chat, I get to talk with Stéphanie and Yoosun all the time. And I know we covered a range of theories. I think there was clear congruence for me in terms of the ideological work that you all are trying to make transparent and how it shapes social work practices in the context of domestic violence, but also in these very taken for granted terms. or that become nodal. They're so taken for granted in their goodness, and yet they're doing a lot of work that's often antithetical to what they intend to be doing, as Yoosun was saying. And I saw some chatter earlier, but if anyone wants to turn on your mic and raise your hand, we'd love to hear your voice. If you prefer to write a question, you can direct it to me, Rupalim, or to Tenzin under the CQ handle, or you can write it in the chat, and we would love to hear your thoughts and questions. Yeah.
Can I say a funny comment while people are raising their hands? I think I'm giggling about your comment about scoping reviews, because I'm in the process of doing a scoping review.
Me too.
with a colleague about trauma-informed care in social work. And the project we want to do and will be doing is, what does trauma-informed care do in social work? And we felt like first we had to do a review in order to understand, what is social work even saying about trauma-informed care? So it's like the first step to doing this deeper work that we want to do.
Yes, thank you for reminding us. It's not that they're all doing the same work in terms of this review of scholarship. So hands, anyone want to turn on your hand? Or I can't see all the pictures because there's luckily 4 pages on my screen. So you'll have to use the digital hand function if you'd like us to call on you, or you can write in the chat a question or comment. It can be one of those, as I say in my class, it doesn't have to be a fully, finished thought. It can be a half thought, a quarter thought. Izumi, thank you for going. Yeah.
It's a quarter thought. It's just so exciting to hear from Yoosun and Stéphanie. It's just very, very stimulating, and it makes me think about what I do as well. So, and I've known 3 of you working together as affiliate co-editors of Chief for the past several years, and envied is not the right word, but just appreciated the space in which your curiosities and intellects and inquiries are nourished in the doctoral education where you met. I'm just assuming, and that I often think about holding a space to do things, holding a space in the classroom so that different narratives can come forward and to become social workers, and where people felt reluctant to share their stories elsewhere. We try to hold space to keep white hegemony at bay so that people can share their thoughts and feelings and experiences and so forth. So my question to you is, maybe it's just an exceptional class of people that showed up at University of Washington, Seattle, the few years that you were there. But I also know that few people at UW at that time were exceptional mentors. So what helped you to cultivate that line of thinking, or sort of inquiries, styles of inquiries to critique and keep on going in different ways after you took off? So what takes to create that space, and what was helpful to you? Thanks.
I actually had to argue my way through the doctoral program. So, I mean, I guess, you could say that it was an organization that did allow me to argue my way through my doctoral program, but
despite.
Yeah, but I mean, I was told multiple times during my doctoral program that perhaps I should be in a different discipline, like English or anthropology, or history. And I was hell-bent on staying in social work because I thought social work needed it more. But also, just things like I wanted to take a course in discourse analysis in the English department, and was told that that wasn't a it wasn't a recognized advanced methods course. Of course, they had no reason for saying that. So, but, it would have to go to the steering committee and get voted on. being in social work, we had to do an exam on an intervention area, and my intervention area was deconstruction. And I remember the doctoral chair, Lou Gilchrist, telling me that, okay, that's not really an intervention, but if you can convince me in writing and at your defense, otherwise, then, we'll let you do it. So, I mean, every part of it was an argument. But I'm heartened to know that ever since I took that discourse analysis class, everyone takes it as a matter of course, because it was now on the books as a viable advanced methods course. So yeah, I mean, maybe it was a space that allowed me to argue, I guess. But I did have to argue everything. I mean, everything.
I'm giggling because I think that's a perfect answer for me as well. My dissertation, it was a participatory action research project with sex workers in Seattle. And I had a sex worker from the community on my doctoral committee with my academic committee members. And that didn't always go so well. I'm remembering a chapter that I got back from my chair that was just, all it said was, "This is shit" on it. And I would say that the UW allowed me to fight, and they allowed me to also argue my way through it. I also took a feminist theory class outside of social work, which opened up a lot for me. And then I would add, some of you know, Dr. Kale Kanuha, she was in my class. And so I had some cohort members that I think are largely responsible for me hanging in there. I actually quit for a while and then returned. So they let me come back. So they let me struggle. And I think the community I had around me, and then some of the feminist theory classes I took outside of the department or school, were really helpful.
I actually think this is really important conversation. Is my memory, and I was in between in terms of cohorts, like somewhere in between the trajectory, the timeline, that the University of Washington, our program at the time, was full of conflict. There was a lot of funding that was very driven by the National Institutes of Health, very by behavioral, very post-positivist, if not completely positivist. Mm-hmm. And I would fight often with instructors and even students who in the classroom would tell me that I was basically wasting people's times because I wanted to talk about epistemes that were not aligned with positivism. So I was told I'm wasting everyone's time. And then there was tolerance for that conflict. And I don't think that's a small thing. I don't mean to say it was easy. I remember watching Yoosun have to fight to do a Derridian methodology and then won. But I don't think it's easy to fight. So I don't want to romanticize that labor, but that there was room for it and a tolerance for the conflict. And I saw that actually when I was teaching too. There was a lot of tolerance for conflict. And I don't mean people are mean to each other, but not agreeing with each other. And that may be an important context for these ideas to grow. Yeah, so I appreciate that part of the conversation. There are a couple of questions I just wanted to turn back to in the chat. And I'll read both. They're different questions. And then Yoosun and Stéphanie, you can decide who wants to respond. From Alyssa, do you think there is room or need for coalition types of projects across human profession fields to do this type of epistemological critique in psychology or therapy, rehab, nursing? So a lot of folks in CQ are coming from different spaces. Another person asking specifically, Stéphanie, to talk more about applying ethics of care in the methodology of your research on domestic violence. Their own doctoral study focuses on so-called self-care of Asian seniors in Canada, interested about involving feminist theories on care as well. There are more questions, but maybe we'll start there. I don't know, Yoosun, if you want to start this kind of interprofessional potential for epistemological work.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we need epistemological work. I mean, I think we need to sort of put these words, ontology, epistemology, ethical onto epistemologies. I mean, because we've gone beyond, postmodern and post-structuralist to the post-materialist, right? The post-humanist. There's so many really interesting things that are happening in theoretical arenas that I think most of these fields, human service professional fields, but also any sort of healthcare fields, are not taking up yet. And that I think it's missing a great deal. So, I have a student who is, she was a disability rights lawyer for a long time, and now she's back in doctoral studies. So she wants to look at disability activism. And so where I've sent her to is to look at post-anthropocentrism, to look at what does it mean when you're talking about, Stephanie knows this. I mean, what does it mean when you're talking about cyborgs? Where does the human body end? What is it mean to be human, right? So, I mean, there's so many ways in which there's interesting ways to really reinvigorate the kinds of things that we're doing, that are, you don't have to reinvent it, it's out there in other fields that are just not being used. And I don't think it's just human service or health fields, because I work in a very interdisciplinary school. I'm seeing people come from departments of government or political science, and I think that they tend to be really conservative in theoretical ways as well. That so I think what I would say is that, yeah, coalition would be great, because if you could hire one person, or if you have that one person who can actually talk across those fields, for instance, and the more interest that we can show around this stuff, then there is more support for actually anybody who does this kind of work. So I think that's a really great idea. But I mean, I would say that for all of us who teach, and all of us who are studying, really foreground these words, epistemology, ontology, ethical onto epistemologies, and to demand, what when you're telling me about an intervention, when you're telling me to read this, where is the theoretical stance in this? Can you actually, do you know why, what can you actually parse it, right? So if the demand is there, then I think yeah, I mean, I'll stop, because this is something I could preach on for a long time, but and pass it over to Stephanie.
Yeah, maybe I'll answer, is it Minhui's question about an ethics of care? I love that question, and I'm excited that this is something you're attending to. Valuing care and feeling like that was an ethic for us in every part of our project started with the ways in which we tended to our relationships to each other and our respective relationships to the institution. So it meant thinking about power and privilege, access to resources, status, protection, time frames. It meant tending to our relationships with agencies and individuals in the community who were doing this work. And it also meant considering those most affected by the topic that we were exploring, which was people who experience intimate partner violence. And when we were designing the study and looking for a question, thinking about data analysis, we were constantly thinking about the relational as well as the impact on the people most affected by these issues that we really cared about. And we didn't see ourselves as outside of those people either, as people who have lived experience, not just working in that arena, but also of violence as well. And what I'll just suggest, I'm not done reading it, but there's a text that recently came out. You probably can't see it because of the blur, but it's Care Ethics in the Age of Precarity by Maurice Hamilton and Michael Flowers. It's an edited text, and it's really, really good. So I would highly recommend that as a resource, Minhui. And I'm also, if you want to contact me personally, I'm happy to have individual conversations about what that might look like for you and your project.
Please.
Can I
Yeah.
answer Anjali's question?
Please. Yeah, please.
So Anjali's question, sorry if I'm massacring your name there. You're talking about in the mental health field, how do we reconstruct some of these terms? And I imagine things like trauma, right? Labeling processes to support the surfacing of what clients come to the systems with and what help they need. So, this is something I think about a lot because we live in the world that we do and we work in the systems that we work in. So you have to deal with what's there. But on the other hand, I constantly wonder about what we miss because you only see what the system allows you to see in many ways. So one of my doc students is doing a project on loss. And she's an Asian American therapist, and she's looking at, she came to the project with the idea that so many of our clients who are Asian American have some sense of loss that has to do with some loss of connection with their family members, whether it's that they don't actually talk to them or something is going on. But what she got really interested, so she wanted to really talk about this sense of loss and realized that there was not a whole lot about it in the literature. So that's what she came to me with. And where I got really interested in it is that something that she sort of told me as an offhand thing, which is that none of them actually identified this loss as a detail worth mentioning. It was never the presenting issue, right? So, so then I started thinking about, when we started thinking about what does that mean? Because it's not in the literature, it's not a problematic that's recognized, right? And there's actually no words for it in many ways. It's not something that we pay attention to. What does it mean, and how is it related to sort of the ambiguous status of Asians in US society as people of color, right? Do you get to claim any sort of a loss along these lines? So what's to me interesting in this area is, yes, we need to deal with, I mean, you have the codes that you have to follow in order to get paid and reimbursed and actually get your clients to function in these medical systems, for instance. But at the same time, I wonder what it is that we don't even see. So, and another point of this is that the way that somaticization is problematized in DSM. I mean, Koreans somatize all over the place. I mean, like, it's a thing, right? And it's like a normal thing. So it's never really, I never made sense of why is it a problem? And really, it's a problem because you think it's a problem, right? So how we categorize, what is the taxonomy of illness or health that we're building and that we're working out of? And we're working out of certain codes of insurance and health codes and everything else. So we do have to pay attention to that, but I want to push back on that system for not allowing us to see, recognize, deal with, and reimagine a different set of taxonomies or different ways of, so this means to me is that the way in which we experience the world, the way we walk through our lives actually is delimited by what we're allowed to see, the kinds of discourses that can name things, right? I hope that makes sense, because this, I think, is a really, really super interesting question.
I think I'm marveling at like the complexity and difficulty of what both of you are talking about, and almost the simplicity, right? If we are dedicated to paying attention to what the ideas and concepts we work with are doing as an ethos, if we become expert at that, I think we'd be much more successful at having our actions align with our values and maybe even our intentions. Of course, I think it would be really hard because the apparatuses we work in they govern us in very visible and invisible ways. I was thinking about Farah's question. Okay, I am doing a synthesis of literature right now. So my nausea might be because I'm also engaged in one. And part of what's been so laborious about it is we try to be very vigilant about looking at how social workers are writing about immigrants in the Canadian context, not as thorough as what Yoosun has done historically in the US context, But I really was curious because I study precarious migration. I work with a lot of grassroots groups who are non-status or precarious in terms of their relationship, their legal relationship, and we know how much that matters. It matters in so many ways and is often invisibilized in terms of like the labor, the time, the harms, the transnational family separations, the poverty, the stress. And most of the articles we found in social work that use that work with immigrants, like their study population are immigrants in Canada, they don't even define the word immigrant. It's so ambiguous, much less pay attention to legal status. And then I feel like, okay, I've been doing this for like 20 years. I must be a total failure if none of my colleagues are paying attention to precarious legal status as a determinant of health. Even if we use that kind of generic framing, it seems like it should matter. And yet there's so many reasons why people are not paying attention to it that I don't understand. So I do think there are ways to do synthesis of existing literature and to bring that critical eye. Maybe we don't call it a systematic or scoping review, and we can, just like with quantitative research that involves a critical lens, I do think we can add that critical lens to any of the methods that we're doing. That's just my quick response to Farah. And I'm mindful of time. Oh, Stéphanie, please.
Well, I was just going to add, I have a couple of suggestions to Farah. So when you are working on the charting for the scoping review and you're identifying what you will chart, really, you know, what you will pull out, look for and pull out in the literature, you can include critical concepts and ideas. For instance, we are explicitly looking for what theories influence or shape or even just mentioned in this project. We are looking for what are the binaries present in this work. We are looking in the case of trauma-informed care, who are the targets, who are the agents? So who are the recipients of trauma-informed care, and who are the professionals, experts, delivering this kind of work. So I think there are ways of getting at some of these critical power dynamics that are of interest to critical research and scholarship, and including that in the charting.
Can I add also I mean, this is, in some ways what discourse analysis does. And what one of the things that I think you should actually go and read Derrida. I think Derrida is really good for scoping review directions. But one of the things that I'm always looking for is what's missing. So not just what's there, but what's missing, and also what's said and then never followed up on. So and sort of the placement of ideas, because so these are all Derridian methods, by the way, of textual analysis, which is reading at the margins is something, is a particular thing. So what gets put in the margins versus in the foreground? So the easiest way to think about that is if you have a syllabus, what's in the recommended readings rather than the required readings, kind of a thing. And I mean, if you're looking at journal articles, literally what's in the margins, like the footnotes, rather than ideas about some. So the relationship of what's there and what's not there, and where it gets placed, and how much time is given. And the other thing that I look at a lot, and this is what I'm doing in doing these keyword studies, is what's the checkbox that has to be said politically, but is never actually really, it's a sleight of hand. I've said it now, and so I don't have to deal with it again. So the missing pieces and the relationship pieces in a text, I think is, if people would start doing that for scoping reviews, then we'd have some really great, interesting pieces coming out.
I think, Yoosun, you need to write a how-to do Derrida, because grammatology is so hard to read, but I think you just made it really transparent about it being a very actionable method of inquiry. I know you've been doing it for a while, but you do it very well.
It's in my dissertation. Look
at my
dissertation,
which is available at the University of Washington. You can look up this dissertation. Thank you all. I know there's so much more to be said, and I didn't even get to ask my question, so I'll just put it as a cliffhanger because I was thinking at what point did we move to abolition in social work or all of these professions? So that's, stay tuned. That'll be the next webinar. I'm going to turn it over to Polly, who's going to round us out. Thank you all for the questions and the comments. I'm so excited, Stéphanie and Yoosun, you took this time to share virtually, and looking forward to when we can next see each other in person. Thanks, everyone. So Polly, over to you.
Rupalim, you're a pro at this. This was awesome. And I think you actually just said there's going to be a sequel to this. So that's all been recorded. So thanks again to Stéphanie, Rupalim, Yoosun. This was like a beautiful experience for all of us who got to witness really interesting dialogue and sharing of your work. And we really appreciate it here at CQ. Just before everyone logs off, just a heads up that the next CQ seminar has been scheduled for March 24th. And another one of our fellows, Sarah Elton, is going to take the hosting role for that. And the speaker will be Nick Fox from the UK. And the title of the work is Doing New Materialist Research from Ontology to Methodology.
Nice.
So hope to see you all there. Thank you to our amazing speakers and Rupalim for taking the hosting job. And have a great day, everybody.